Hey, tonight we're diving into something deeply unpleasant and oddly soothing. Not ghosts, not true crime, just the stuff that kept medieval doctors awake at night and occasionally covered in boils. We're talking real diseases, the ones that oozed, festered, exploded, or politely melted you from the inside out. Forget WebMD. These are the nightmares that came before the internet. The 100 most disturbing diseases in human history. Slow, fast, loud, silent, and always inconvenient. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it keeps me from having to go back to 17th century barber surgery. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this strange little global sleepover keeps growing. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, one rash, fever, and spontaneous nosebleed at a time. You're going to sleep great after this. Probably. Somewhere in the great and terrible cabinet of historical afflictions is a drawer labeled skin stuff. You do not want to open this drawer. But tonight, we will very slowly, with gloves on, a morbid sense of curiosity, and maybe a loose plan to shower afterward. Skin, as it turns out, is where history gets especially creative with its cruelty. It's visible, sensitive, and very bad at hiding when something's gone wrong. And when it does go wrong, it doesn't whisper. It peels. It oozes. It flakes. It becomes a canvas for rot, rash, and, inevitably, deep regret. Let's begin with a celebrity of skin-based suffering, smallpox. For centuries, this virus strutted around the world like an unwelcome houseguest that also stole your face. It started like a fever, a chill, maybe a headache, innocent enough. But then came the rash. And not a subtle rash. We're talking full-body, cratered pustules that scabbed over and left survivors looking like they lost a bar fight with a beehive. Smallpox was equal opportunity. Kings, queens, beggars, explorers, and even entire civilizations got flattened by it. The mortality rate was horrifying, but in some ways, the survival stories were worse. Permanent scarring, blindness, and the lifelong suspicion that anyone sneezing nearby might be plotting your demise. Next up is leprosy, a disease so biblical it practically comes with its own desert soundtrack. For much of history, leprosy was a blanket term for anything that made your skin look haunted. But real Hansen's disease, the proper name, attacked nerves and skin, slowly numbing limbs and deforming features. It didn't kill quickly, but it did exile you from society, sometimes literally. Leper colonies were the historical equivalent of a group chat you couldn't leave, but also couldn't ever rejoin civilization from. What made it worse? It spread slowly, quietly, and often with a smile. A lingering handshake, a shared cloth, a prayer at the wrong temple. Then there's necrotizing fasciitis, or as it's affectionately known, flesh-eating bacteria. Not a medieval legend, not a horror movie plot. Just bacteria that gets into a tiny wound and decides your thigh is now soup. It spreads fast. Like you had an itchy spot and now it's Tuesday and you're missing a leg. Fast. Surgeons sometimes had to choose between amputation or, well, waiting for nature to finish lunch. It's rare, but when it shows up, everyone panics just a little harder than they admit. Moving on to syphilis, which, fun fact, was once called the Great Imitator, because it could look like basically any disease, and also like none of them. The rash phase came in round 2, after the initial sore had made its quiet exit. Suddenly, the skin erupted. Palms, soles, scalp, nothing was safe. The rash didn't always itch, but it looked like it should, and sometimes it glowed faintly under moonlight, or so the terrified poets claimed. Left untreated, syphilis could burrow into the brain, destroy bones, and spark entire Renaissance novels. Lastly, ergotism, the slow, nightmarish product of eating rye bread laced with a hallucinogenic fungus. At first, it tingled. Then, the limbs began to burn. Not metaphorically. They actually burned. Some called it St. Anthony's fire. which sounds holy but mostly meant your fingers were blackening and dropping off while you saw angels fighting snakes in your soup. It decimated villages, spawned accusations of witchcraft, and possibly inspired half the weird behavior at Salem. So there you have it. 5 very real, very unpleasant reminders that your skin is both armor and alarm system, and history, for whatever reason, loved testing its limits. Sleep tight tonight and maybe moisturize, just in case. Some diseases go for subtlety. A cough here, a spot there, a slow decline you can whisper about while pouring tea. Not these. These diseases are loud, fast, and furious, and their favorite place to start is somewhere deep inside you, usually right next to an artery. Tonight, we're looking at a special class of viruses that don't just make you sick, they make you liquefy, gently, horrifically, sometimes all at once. Let's start with the drama queen of the bunch, Ebola. It doesn't mess around. First discovered near the Ebola River in the 1970s, this viral hemorrhagic fever acts like it missed its calling as a slasher film. It begins innocently enough: fever, headache, fatigue. But then your insides panic. Capillaries break down. Blood vessels leak. You start bleeding from places that don't normally have blood. It's not a nosebleed. It's a full system collapse with mood lighting. And the worst part? You're still alive for most of it, watching, dripping, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it was just food poisoning. It wasn't. Next up, Marburg virus. Think of it as Ebola's equally unstable cousin, also from Africa, also with terrifyingly high fatality rates. Marburg likes to hide in fruit bats and wait. Then it leaps into humans and begins its usual haunted house routine. Fever, chills, muscle pain, and then the bleeding. Always the bleeding. What makes Marburg extra mean is how fast it takes over. One moment, you're at a conference in Frankfurt. The next, you're in a biohazard tent with doctors wearing more layers than a medieval knight. And then there's Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. Not as famous, but equally spiteful. It's carried by ticks and livestock, making it the perfect excuse to cancel your rural vacation plans. Once inside you, it triggers fever, dizziness, and the sudden realization that your organs are not as attached as you'd like them to be. Bleeding from the gums, eyes, and other places follows. It's fast, brutal, and comes with no elegant Latin name to soften the blow. Just raw, geographic honesty and a high chance of needing your will updated. Lassa fever adds a different note to this gory choir. Found mostly in West Africa and spread through contaminated rat droppings, Lassa is quieter at first. You might think it's just a bad cold until the vomiting starts, and the bleeding, and then more vomiting. It loves to confuse the immune system. In some cases, you get better. In others, your internal organs get into a heated disagreement and never reconcile. What makes it extra sneaky is that many cases are mild or asymptomatic. The virus lingers in the community, a ticking biological time bomb with tiny paws. Finally, dengue hemorrhagic fevera, tropical surprise that shows up with a mosquito bite and leaves with your dignity. Regular dengue is miserable enough. Joint pain, fever, rash, but in its hemorrhagic form, it goes full Shakespearean tragedy. Blood plasma leaks, gums ooze. The circulatory system gives up like a bored intern. In severe cases, the body turns into a leaking, bruised balloon in desperate need of modern medicine and a lot of fluids. And if you survive, congrats, you're now terrified of mosquitoes forever. These are not the sniffles. They're not even call a doctor illnesses. They are call everyone and hope for the best while your insides turn to soup viruses. And yet, humans keep surviving them, studying them, fighting them, because that's what we do: stare into the abyss, take notes, and invent vaccines while sweating profusely. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in and feel that one slightly suspicious itch, remember, your body is doing heroic work right now, holding you together, keeping the blood in. Dream gently of sterile hospital rooms and brave epidemiologists. And please avoid the fruit bats. Some plagues are quiet. They slip in unnoticed, spread silently, and vanish like a bad smell. Not these ones. These are the plagues, with stage, presence loud, dramatic, and absolutely desperate for attention. They didn't just kill people. They rewrote history, inspired artwork, collapsed economies, and, in some cases, made survivors question whether taking a bath was actually a good idea. If diseases had personalities, these would be the loud, chaotic ones who show up uninvited, drink too much, and set your house on fire before blaming the rats. Let's begin with a celebrity, the Black Death. Mid-1300s Europe had many problems: wars, poverty, weird hats, but none quite like the arrival of Yersinia pestis. Carried by fleas, riding rats like tiny chariots of doom, the plague exploded across the continent, killing anywhere from 30% to 60% of the population. That's not a typo. People dropped in the streets. Whole towns emptied. No one knew why. Some blamed the stars, others blamed sin, and a few blamed cats, which made it worse because the cats were actually eating the rats. Bulbous, large, painful, black swellings made the disease unmistakable. It was fast, furious, and left behind a traumatized Europe filled with frescoes of skeletons holding hands with peasants. But it wasn't the first time Yersinia pestis showed up. Meet the Justinian plague, its older, equally unstable sibling. This one hit the Byzantine Empire around the year 541 CE and was kind enough to stick around for nearly 2 centuries. Emperor Justinian caught it and survived, which is more than we can say for millions of others. Ships carried it, trade spread it, and soon the Mediterranean was basically a plague theme park. Fields emptied, armies dissolved. It arguably sped up the fall of Rome, which is a lot of pressure for a bacterium. Think of it as the dress rehearsal for the Black Death, but with more togas and fewer medical theories. Now to Mexico, 1545. Enter Cocolistli, which translates roughly to pest in Nahuatl. But that word doesn't really cover what happened. Entire communities of indigenous peoples were devastated. Symptoms included high fever, bleeding from the ears, blackened tongues, and hallucinations. The death toll may have been even worse than the Black Death in some areas. We still don't know exactly what it was. Possibly a hemorrhagic fever, maybe a European-introduced virus, or even something native to the region. But it swept through like a vengeful storm and left deep scars in both memory and population charts. And let's not forget the pneumonic plague, the Black Death's extroverted cousin. Unlike the bubonic form, which needs fleas and takes a little time, pneumonic plague just hops into your lungs and explodes. It's airborne, fast, and incredibly lethal. You could cough on someone in the morning and bury them by nightfall. It often accompanied bubonic outbreaks, meaning just when you thought things couldn't get worse, they did. It's like a final boss that also sneezes on you. Finally, the modern Yersinia pestis. Yes, it still exists. No, it's not extinct. But now we have antibiotics, which is great because cases still appear in places like Madagascar, China, and even the US Southwest. Every so often, someone camping gets a little too cozy with a flea-ridden rodent and makes headlines. But thanks to science and penicillin, it's no longer an apocalypse. Just an unfortunate camping story and several very cautious phone calls. So yes, these plagues had personality. Big, aggressive, history-altering personality. And tonight, as you fall asleep in your relatively plague-free bed, take a moment to appreciate how quiet your lymph nodes are, and maybe send a thank you to soap, antibiotics, and indoor plumbing. Smell isn't just a sense. It's a warning. Your nose is history's oldest doctor, picking up on danger before your brain finishes its morning coffee. And when disease strikes, smell is often the first thing to change. Infections, rot, pus, decay, they all carry their own bouquet. Tonight, we explore the stinkiest ailments history has to offer, the ones that entered a room before the patient did. The diseases that didn't just kill you, they made sure everyone else knew about it from across the room. Let's start with typhus, a disease that, like a bad roommate, thrives in crowded, dirty environments, and never leaves on time. Carried by lice and nicknamed jail fever, typhus loves prisons, refugee camps, and the unwashed portions of 18th century navies. It comes on strong, high fever, chills, delirium, and then comes the smell. That sour, musky, decomposing stench of someone whose body has decided it would rather ferment than sweat. Typhus didn't just make you sick, it made you impossible to ignore. Even if you couldn't speak, you could still clear a room. Next up, gangrene. This one doesn't play coy. It announces itself early and often, with the scent of rotting flesh marinated in regret. When blood stops flowing thanks to injury, frostbite, or infection, your tissues start to die, and dead tissue smells unforgettable. It's sweet and sour, metallic and moldy, like meat left on a radiator wrapped in gym socks. Soldiers feared it. Surgeons gagged at it. Amputation was often the only cure, and even that didn't always arrive fast enough to beat the stench. Gangrene doesn't just take your limb, it takes your dignity first. Then there's diphtheria, a throat infection with ideas above its station. Caused by a toxin-producing bacterium, diphtheria coats the throat and nasal passages in a thick gray slime called a pseudomembrane. This membrane smells bad. Imagine a mix of wet cardboard, expired yogurt, and something vaguely metallic that's just on a good day. It obstructs breathing, causes horrible coughing, and makes your breath a biological weapon. In the pre-antibiotic days, children especially were vulnerable, and you could often hear and smell the infection before seeing it. A gray, wheezing, foul-smelling cloud of illness. Now let's discuss trench mouth, which sounds like a war injury but is actually a raging gum infection that flourishes in poor hygiene and high stress. Think World War I trenches. Think stressed-out college students with zero flossing. Technically called necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. Trench mouth is a bacterial overload in the mouth that causes ulcers, bleeding gums, and a smell so foul it was said to chase away field medics. It's like your mouth died before the rest of you and decided to alert the neighbors. Finally, scrofula. It sounds like a Dickensian insult, but it's actually a form of tuberculosis that targets the lymph nodes in your neck. Historically known as the king's evil, because royalty claimed the power to heal it by touch. Spoiler, they couldn't. Scrofula caused open sores that oozed, crusted, and you guessed, it smelled. The scent was reportedly earthy, putrid, and unmistakably sick. Scrofula made you look cursed and smell worse. So yes, some diseases were deadly, others disfiguring, but these added insult to injury by ensuring no one could forget your presence. A slow rot, a sour breath, a wafting trail of bacterial drama. Sleep well tonight, and maybe brush your teeth a little extra. Your future historians will thank you. There's something uniquely terrifying about your own brain turning against you. It's the control center, the main character, the thing that makes you, you. So when it breaks not from trauma, but from infection, protein misfolding, or mysterious invaders, the horror isn't just physical, it's existential. These diseases don't just harm the body. They twist perception, erase memory, scramble personality. Tonight, we're cracking open the skull's darkest chapters. No scalpels, just nightmares. Let's begin with rabies. It starts deceptively simple. A bite from an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a dog. You clean it, bandage it, shrug. Days or weeks pass. You feel fine. Then the fever hits, the anxiety, the tingling. Then, as the virus climbs your nerves toward the brain like a very determined houseguest, something changes. Water becomes terrifying. Bright lights feel violent. You become restless, aggressive. You panic at the thought of swallowing. That's hydrophobia, not metaphorical fear, but literal throat spasms that make even water unbearable. Eventually, you fall into seizures, coma, and death. Once symptoms begin, survival is almost unheard of. Rabies is a one-way trip into primal madness. Next up, prion disease, or, as it's affectionately known, the "you ate what?" disorder. Prions are misfolded proteins, They're not alive, technically. They don't reproduce. But once inside your brain, they convince other proteins to start folding the wrong way too. Think of it as origami instructions from hell. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, mad cow, Oddities are all names for prion-based brain melt. Symptoms? Memory loss, hallucinations, tremors, mood swings, rapid decline, no cure. It's like watching a personality unravel thread by thread until only a husk is left, smiling vaguely at furniture. Now we travel to Africa, where the tsetse fly brings you a charming souvenir called African sleeping sickness. It starts with fever and joint pain. Then it escalates. The parasite crosses into the brain, and things get strange. Day becomes night. You fall asleep mid-conversation, mid-meal, mid-anything. Your internal clock breaks. You hallucinate. Your speech slurs. Left untreated, it drags you into a twilight coma and shuts the system down. Some victims wander in dreamlike states for weeks, caught between reality and delusion, before slipping away entirely. It's sleep, but sinister. Enter encephalitis lethargica, also known as the sleepy sickness. This mysterious pandemic swept the world around the time of World War I, affecting millions. Victims suddenly fell into deep stupors, unable to move or speak but still aware. Some remained trapped like that for years. Others awoke with tremors, muscle rigidity, or complete personality changes. We still don't fully understand what caused it, and it disappeared just as mysteriously as it came. Oliver Sacks famously wrote about patients who were awakened decades later with the drug eldopaonly to relapse into silence. Imagine watching decades slip by while your body hibernates against your will. And finally, neurosyphilis, the grand finale of untreated syphilis. If you let that spiral long enough, the bacteria eventually makes its way into the brain and spinal cord, causing madness, paralysis, delusions of grandeur, and some spectacularly unfortunate poetry. It was common enough in the 19th century to be almost trendy. By the time symptoms appeared, patients might believe they were prophets, emperors, or made of glass. Their minds slipped quietly through a door no one else could follow, often with elegance, always with tragedy. So sleep well tonight, and give your brain a little gratitude. It keeps your name, your thoughts, your dreams, your you-ness. And while these diseases may seem far away, they remind us of how fragile that mental machinery really is. One infection, one protein, one invisible invader, and suddenly, the lights are on but the map is gone. Keep your windows closed, your meat cooked, and your dreams gentle. The brain deserves it. Some invaders break the door down. Others slip in quietly, unpack a suitcase, and start rearranging the furniture. Parasites are the latter. They're not interested in a quick kill. They want a long-term lease inside your body. Some sneak into your intestines. Others nest in your eyeballs. A few erupt from your skin like poorly timed confetti. Tonight, we're opening the door to history's most unwelcome houseguests, the ones that squirm, hatch, burrow, and borrow your organs without even saying thank you. Let's begin with a truly nightmarish classic, the guinea worm. This charming thread of horror enters the body through contaminated water, usually when you drink it. Inside that water, tiny water fleas hosting invisible larvae. Once inside you, the larvae mature, mate, and then the females up to 3 feet long begin their journey downward. Literally. They slither through your tissue, heading for your lower limbs. You don't feel much at first, until, one day, a blister appears. It burns. You itch, you poke it, and out pops the tip of a worm, ready to exit. No joke. Removal involves wrapping the emerging worm around a stick, and slowly, very slowly pulling it out over several days or even weeks. One wrong tug, and it snaps, leaving you with a potential infection and a haunting new phobia of puddles. Next, the botfly. This creature saw the concept of personal boundaries and said, "No thanks." Botflies don't crawl inside on their own. No, they outsource. A female botfly finds a mosquito, lays her eggs on it, and lets the mosquito deliver them to your skin, like a gruesome gift with purchase. The eggs hatch, the larvae burrow, and soon you've got a living, breathing maggot wriggling just beneath the surface of your skin. People have reported feeling them move. Feel them. Removal methods range from surgical extraction to suffocating the larvae with petroleum jelly, which forces them to wriggle out for air. That's right, you can lure your parasite out like a tiny, unwanted groundhog. Then we have the classic, the tapeworm. Ancient, long, flat, and deeply committed to its lifestyle. You get it from undercooked meat. It settles into your intestines. It grows, and grows, and grows. Some species reach over 20 feet in length. The kicker? You might not even feel it. It just quietly eats your food, makes you anemic, and occasionally wiggles its way into places it shouldn't, like your brain. Tapeworms are technically segmented, and some of those segments can break off, exit your body, and continue the nightmare cycle somewhere else. They are, in every possible sense, overachievers. Loa loa, also known as the African eyeworm, adds a touch of horror to ophthalmology. Transmitted by deerflies, this parasitic worm lives in the subcutaneous tissue and sometimes makes surprise appearances in the eyeball. Yes, the actual eyeball. Victims have reported feeling something move across their vision, only to discover a living worm crawling under the conjunctiva. It's not fatal, but it's deeply unnerving, and removing it requires a steady hand and, ideally, zero squeamishness. Last but not least, the liver fluke. This flatworm has a complex life cycle involving snails, fish, and your bile ducts. Humans get infected by eating undercooked freshwater fish. The flukes migrate to the liver and settle in for the long haul, causing inflammation, bile duct blockages, and sometimes cancer. They don't move fast, they don't shout, but they stick around. Like toxic roommates in a shared apartment, slowly destroying the plumbing and refusing to leave. So tonight, as you lie in your clean, parasite-free bed, we hope, remember this: you are a tempting ecosystem, a walking Airbnb for the microscopic. But with clean water, proper cooking, and a little luck, you can keep your body off the guest list, sleep tight, and maybe skip the sushi for a while. There's a special category of disease that lurks in the shadows of history, whispered about in old textbooks, nervously discussed in clinics, and very rarely mentioned at family dinners. These are the sexually transmitted infections that did more than just cause awkward rashes or uncomfortable phone calls. These are the ones that left scars, broke minds, melted flesh, and turned the pursuit of pleasure into a medical cautionary tale. Tonight, we lower the lights and open the case files on the STDs that even textbooks wince at, where symptoms read like horror fiction, and treatments were often worse than the infection. Let's start once again with syphilis. Yes, again, because syphilis is the drama queen of STDs, and it deserves its second act. The thing about syphilis is that it comes in stages, like a theatrical performance, each more disturbing than the last. Stage 1 is a painless sore. Stage 2 is a rash that may or may not show up on your hands and feet. Stage 3 is where things get psychedelic and medieval. Bone deterioration, neurological decline, personality changes, and in some cases, delusions of grandeur. It was nicknamed the Great Imitator because it could look like almost any other illness, confusing doctors for centuries. It affected kings, composers, painters, and entire royal lineages. Treated with mercury before penicillin came around, the cure was often just as toxic as the disease. A historical footnote? Hardly. It's still out there, whispering sweet nothings and spreading awkwardly. Next is gonorrhea, often overshadowed by its flashier cousin but no less disturbing. Nicknamed the clap, its origins remain a mystery. Some say the name comes from old treatments that involved slamming infected body parts to clear the pus. Yes, really. Gonorrhea is caused by a stubborn little bacterium that thrives in moist, mucus-lined areas and absolutely despises antibiotics, especially now. Symptoms include painful urination, discharges of mysterious color and consistency, and, if left untreated, infertility, and joint pain. The worst part? Many people show no symptoms at all, letting the bacteria quietly travel and multiply. It's the disease equivalent of a party crasher that doesn't even knock. Chancroid is next less famous, more horrifying. Caused by Haemophilus ducreyi, it produces painful ulcers, usually on the genitals, which ooze pus and bleed easily. Unlike syphilis's polite, painless sore, chancroid shows up with full-volume screaming and a visible infection that looks straight out of a zombie movie. It was once a leading cause of genital ulcers in certain parts of the world, and while rarer now, it hasn't vanished. It's the loud guest you hope never gets invited to your personal party. Now let's discuss lymphogranuloma venereum, or LGV proof, that even the most unassuming names can hide a monster. LGV starts with a small sore easily missed. Then the lymph nodes swell. Then they rupture. We're talking buboes that burst, sometimes discharging foul-smelling fluid. It was historically prevalent in tropical regions, but has recently re-emerged in parts of Europe and North America, especially in certain populations. It's the silent creeper of STDs, tiptoeing past your immune system until it detonates something tender. And finally, donovanosis. This one doesn't play by your rules. Caused by Klebsiella granulomatis, it doesn't create ulcers, it creates beefy red growths that bleed easily and expand, like they're auditioning for a B-movie. It's rare, primarily found in parts of India, Papua New Guinea, and the Caribbean. But when it strikes, it's unforgettable. Left untreated, it can destroy tissue and cause disfiguring damage. There's no pain at first, just the unsettling realization that something down there is blooming when it very much shouldn't. So sleep softly tonight, and remember that curiosity is fine, but historical STDs are better left in textbooks. Be grateful for modern medicine, uncomfortable as it can be, and the miracle of antibiotics. And maybe say a silent thank you to latex. The past was itchy. Let's keep it that way. The Victorians were nothing if not theatrical. From fainting couches to black lace mourning attire, they turned even suffering into a spectacle. So naturally, their diseases followed suit, decadent, tragic, and always ready to make an entrance. Tonight, we dim the gas lamps and wander into the sick rooms of the 19th century, where ailments didn't just afflict the body, they wrote entire operas across it. These are the diseases that defined a generation obsessed with death, drama, and poetic last words. First, tuberculosis, the crown jewel of Victorian illness. Also known as consumption, it was the disease of choice for tragic heroines and sensitive poets. It didn't just kill, it romanticized you. Victims wasted away slowly, becoming paler, thinner, and more delicate by the week. The coughing fits were violent and bloody, but somehow still portrayed in paintings as graceful and serene. Artists called it the White Plague. Society whispered about it like a lover's betrayal. And the saddest part? It really was everywhere. It spread through coughs, kisses, and crowded tenements. Whole families faded under its grip, and yet, thanks to its slow, ghostly progression, it was bizarrely fashionable to have. In the same way we romanticize insomnia now, the Victorians gave tuberculosis the full Gothic treatment, beauty in decay. Next, scarlet fever, a bacterial infection that started like strep throat but quickly escalated into a full-body performance. High fever, bright red rash, swollen tongue that turned strawberry pinkett, was dramatic enough to cause panic and contagious enough to empty entire classrooms. Children were especially vulnerable, and recovery didn't guarantee safety. Some survivors developed lifelong complications like heart or kidney damage. Others were left with mild hearing loss or neurological quirks. It was fast, flashy, and terrifying, and it made every mother in London check her child's skin daily for anything redder than usual. Then comes dropsy, the old-fashioned term for edema fluid retention that made ankles swell, bellies distend, and faces puff like marshmallows. It wasn't a disease itself, but rather a symptom of something far worse: heart failure, kidney disease, or liver damage. Victorians didn't know that, of course. They just saw people balloon painfully and die slowly, Some blamed watery blood. Others assumed divine punishment. Doctors attempted to drain the fluid with leeches or simply tightened corsets until breathing became optional. The result? A slow motion drowning inside your own tissues. Very on brand for the era. Rickets, on the other hand, was more of a socio-economic monologue. Caused by a lack of vitamin D, calcium, or sunlight, it warped children's bones, bowed their legs, and stunted their growth. It was most common among the poor, who worked long hours in sooty factories or crowded into sunless city apartments. The rich could afford fresh air. The poor got rickets. It became a visible sign of industrial neglect, a generation of bent, limping children growing up under the weight of soot and structural inequality. And like all Victorian tragedies, it was largely preventable. Lastly, we must mention hysteriolus, a disease, more a catch-all diagnosis for woman doing something inconvenient. Symptoms included anxiety, fainting, sexual desire, too much talking, not enough smiling, or simply having opinions. Men didn't get hysteria. Women got it for breathing wrong. Treatments ranged from cold baths and rest cures to, well, let's say manual stimulation. And leave it there. Doctors prescribed vibrators before they prescribed agency. Hysteria became a cultural performance, part science, part sexism, all nonsense. But it filled asylums, fueled novels, and reminded everyone that the line between medical care and moral control was always paper thin. So tonight, if your lungs feel clear and your bones are straight and no one has prescribed you a fainting couch, be grateful. The Victorian sickroom was a theater of high drama, and not everyone got a graceful exit. Close the velvet curtains. Let the ghost of tuberculosis cough itself to sleep. And you, just breathe. Colonialism didn't just bring flags, guns, and languages. It brought pathogens. Invisible stowaways tucked inside breath, sweat, and blood. Stepping off ships with all the enthusiasm of a missionary and none of the consent. The age of exploration wasn't just about maps and gold, it was a microbial apocalypse for many. Whole continents, previously unexposed to old-world diseases, suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of history's most brutal handshake. Tonight, we chart the collisions that weren't just cultural, they were viral, bacterial, and parasitic. Let's start with smallpox in the Americas. This wasn't a simple outbreak. It was a biological earthquake. The native populations had never encountered it before. No immunity, no warning. When Europeans landed, they didn't need to fire a single shot at first. Smallpox did the work for them. Villages collapsed. Civilizations unraveled. The Inca and Aztec empires, with all their brilliance and cities and sacred rituals, were wiped out not by steel, but by scabs. The symptoms were classic smallpox: fever, body aches, then the rash pustules that covered the skin, filled with fluid and either scarred or killed. Mortality rates were as high as 90% in some indigenous communities. Entire generations vanished. And as colonial powers claimed the land, they often credited their conquest to divine right, ignoring that their greatest weapon was accidental sneezing. Then came malaria, a parasite, not a virus, spread by mosquitoes, not people. But oh, did it travel well. In parts of Africa, malaria had long been a fact of life, terrible, yes, but somewhat managed through inherited immunity and cultural adaptation. In colonial outposts, though, especially in tropical zones, malaria cut through settlers like a scythe through damp wheat. Fever, chills, sweating, and then more fever. It cycled, relentlessly. Colonizers tried quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, and while it helped, it didn't cure. Malaria-shaped colonial strategy, entire regions were avoided or feared simply because of the mosquitoes. It wasn't just a disease, it was a territorial negotiation. Yellow fever followed like an angry cousin, also mosquito-borne, also fond of warm, wet climates. But where malaria lingered, yellow fever struck hard and fast. High fever, jaundice, hence the yellow, internal bleeding, and death sometimes within days. Colonial ports like Havana and New Orleans were especially vulnerable. During outbreaks, cities emptied, ships burned, and hospitals overflowed. It hit both colonizer and colonized, but in unfamiliar environments, European immune systems had the consistency of wet tissue. Colonies didn't just expand with muskets, they trembled with every mosquito season. Cholera came next, a true equal opportunity killer. Spread through contaminated water, it tore through colonial cities built too fast and plumbed too poorly. One sip from the wrong bucket, and the diarrhea would start. Relentless, watery, dehydrating you faster than most 19th century doctors could write your name. Blue lips, sunken eyes, cramped intestines, death within hours. In some regions, cholera followed trade routes like a fan on tour. Entire populations were blamed wrongly, of course, and public sanitation only improved after cities lost thousands. And still, the colonizers pushed forward, building empires on the bones of the parched and purged. Last, we meet hookworm, the quieter horror, not as dramatic, but deeply personal. Spread through soil contaminated by human waste, it enters through bare feet and makes its way to your intestines, where it drinks your blood, not metaphorically, literally. Chronic hookworm causes fatigue, anemia, developmental delays. In plantations and mining camps, where people worked barefoot and bathed in rivers, hookworm turned strength into sluggishness. It didn't kill immediately, it just drained, slowly, day by day. So tonight, if your water's clean, your feet are protected, and your air isn't carrying something with a centuries-old vendetta, take a deep breath. The colonial age reshaped the globe not just in borders, but in pathogens. The body count wasn't always visible, but it was there, under the skin, waiting. Sleep tight, keep the bugs out. History did not. Some diseases don't attack your lungs or your liver. They aim straight for your sense of self. They arrive without fever, without rash, but with a bizarre and often terrifying symptom, behavior. Tonight, we tiptoe into the strange corners of medical history, where people didn't just fall ill, they danced until collapse, barked like dogs, howled at the moon, or screamed in perfect synchrony with their neighbors. These are the afflictions that blurred the line between madness, mystery, and mass suggestion. They're unsettling, often unexplained, and a reminder that sometimes the human mind can be the most haunted place of all. Let's start with the grandest of these strange outbreaks, the dancing plague of 1518. In the sweltering summer of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance. Not joyfully, not gracefully, just endlessly. No music, no shoes, no break. Soon others joined, dozens, then hundreds. They danced in agony, limbs shaking, bodies collapsing from exhaustion, some reportedly dancing themselves to death. Physicians had no explanation. Religious leaders blamed demons. Some thought it was a form of mass possession. The city eventually hired musicians to play along, thinking it might help. It didn't. The dancing lasted for weeks. No one really knows why. Famine? Ergot poisoning? Psychological stress? Maybe. Or maybe it was just history having a deeply unfunny episode. Closely related is tarantism, named not after the terrifying spider, but the belief that one had been bitten by one. Victims, mostly in southern Italy during the 15th to 17th centuries, would break into frantic, often erotic dancing, claiming it was the only cure for the venom. The music played was called the tarantella, and it was so fast-paced you'd think the violinist was running from their own regrets. No actual tarantulas were ever proven guilty, but the outbreaks were real, and the dancing again often ended in collapse or seizure. Some say it was just an excuse to escape repression. Others blame mass psychogenic illness. Either way, it's an oddly rhythmic kind of suffering. Then there's lycanthroponaut, the Hollywood werewolf kind, but the delusion that one is a wolf, or at least becoming one. Historically, recorded cases describe people howling, crawling on all fours, growling, attacking livestock, and insisting they had fur. Physicians in the Middle Ages documented these cases with a mix of fascination and horror. Treatments varied from exorcisms to beatings to, in one unfortunate instance, actual execution. The condition itself is now understood as a rare psychiatric disorder, but in the right cultural context, say, a town already worried about witches, it became a death sentence. Mass hysteria, or as it's now more politely called, mass psychogenic illness, is the umbrella under which many of these events fall. It's the rapid spread of symptoms, physical or emotional, through a community with no identifiable pathogen. One person faints, then another. Suddenly, a dozen schoolgirls are twitching, speaking in tongues, or refusing to walk. Entire convents have erupted in meowing fits. Nuns have barked, bitten, screamed. Often, it starts in high-stress, high-repression environment, schools, cloisters, closed communities. It burns fast, leaves confusion, and resists every attempt at rational explanation. And finally, St. Vitus's curse, named after the patron saint of dancing, epilepsy, and for some reason, oversharing. This catch-all diagnosis was used for mysterious seizures, spasms, and movements that resembled everything from chorea to possession. Pilgrims would travel to shrines for healing, only to find entire crowds convulsing together in what looked like a holy rave gone wrong. Today, doctors might see Huntington's disease, or Tourette's, or epilepsy in these descriptions. But back then, it was the work of saints, or sin, or both. So tonight, as you drift off, think of those strange outbreaks where bodies rebelled in rhythm, where minds convinced flesh to twist, twitch, or howl. These weren't just diseases. They were performances, accidental, collective, and terrifying. And just maybe, a reminder that the brain, under pressure, sometimes chooses the strangest ways to scream. Sleep well, try not to dance. Blood is usually the quiet hero in the background, flowing, transporting, clotting when it's supposed to, keeping the whole machine oiled and oxygenated. But when blood goes wrong, it doesn't whisper. It spills, it clots, it warps into something unrecognizable. Tonight, we open the veins of history metaphorically and take a long, unsettling look at the diseases that turn blood from lifeline to liability. These aren't just illnesses. They're slow mutinies from within, and sometimes they're painfully poetic. Let's begin with hemophilia, the so-called royal disease. It's a genetic disorder that affects the blood's ability to clot. For most people, a cut is a brief inconvenience. For someone with hemophilia, it's a threat. Internal bleeding can start from a bump, a bruise, or even without warning. Joints swell, organs bleed, pain becomes routine. In the 19th century, the disease gained notoriety in European royalty, especially through Queen Victoria's lineage. Her descendants carried the faulty gene across the thrones of Europe, turning nosebleeds into palace emergencies. There was no cure, just caution. Castles became medical wards. Princes were raised in quiet fear of scraped knees and political fallout. Polycythemia vera, on the other hand, is the opposite problem. It's too much blood, or more specifically, too many red blood cells. This rare bone marrow disorder thickens the blood until it moves like syrup through your veins. That extra density increases the risk of clots, strokes, heart attacks, basically, the vascular equivalent of rush hour traffic with no exits. People with polycythemia vera often feel itchy after a hot shower because the blood vessels dilate and flood the skin with slow, overpopulated cells. It's a slow squeeze from the inside. A disease that doesn't gush it, suffocates. Then there's sickle cell disease, which turns round, flexible red blood cells into sharp, sickle-shaped fragments. These mutated cells are brittle, sticky, and prone to clumping together in painful bottlenecks. Blood stops flowing, organs cry out, bones ache. It's most prevalent among people of African, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern descent, a cruel genetic trade-off for inherited malaria resistance. In historical contexts, the pain of sickle cell wasn't always understood. Children were labeled lazy, moody, weak. Their suffering was invisible until it erupted in crisis fevers, strokes, infections. Modern medicine can manage it, but the shadow of inherited pain lingers across generations. Leukemia changes the blood at a cellular level. It's cancer of the body's blood-forming tissues, bone marrow, lymphatic system, white blood cells. But instead of fighting infection, these white cells multiply uncontrollably and don't know when to stop. They crowd out healthy cells. The immune system falters, fatigue deepens, bones ache. Bruises blossom like bad omens. There are many forms: acute, chronic, fast, slow, but all share that fundamental betrayal. Your blood, once protector, has joined the enemy. In the past, it was a death sentence. Today, there are treatments, hope, even remission, but it still carries the weight of that ancient fear: blood gone rogue. And then there's porphyria, group of rare disorders that interfere with the body's ability to produce heme, a vital component of hemoglobin. Symptoms vary, but some forms of porphyria cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight, blistering skin, abdominal pain, dark urine, and mental disturbances. In the Middle Ages, sufferers of porphyria may have been mistaken for vampires. Pale skin, aversion to light, reddish teeth from blood pigment buildup. It fit the legend a little too well. Even in modern times, porphyria has an aura of cursed nobility. Some believe King George III had it. Others say it haunted old family lines, like a genetic ghost. So sleep softly tonight and be grateful your blood is boring. These diseases remind us that what flows inside us isn't just life, it's a delicate equation. Tip it too far in any direction, and history starts to write your story in red. Childhood should be the softest part of life: mud, pies, naps, slightly sticky fingers. But history had other ideas. For most of humanity's timeline, childhood was a perilous journey filled with coughing fits, rashes, muscle paralysis, and very real odds of not making it past age 5. Tonight, we tiptoe into that unnerving cradle of historical illness, where childhood diseases weren't rites of passage, they were Russian roulette in a nursery. Let's begin with whooping cough, officially known as pertussis, unofficially known as the sound that haunted every 19th century household. It starts like a cold runny nose, low fever, but then comes the cough, violent, gasping, relentless. It doesn't let go. Children coughed until their lips turned blue, until they vomited, until they fractured ribs. The infamous whoop came from the desperate gasp for air between spasms, like a tiny body begging for oxygen while its lungs tried to climb out. It was wildly contagious and could sweep through entire communities, especially in pre-vaccine days. The youngest were the most vulnerable, and for many, the cough never stopped. Now let's talk measles, the measliest of plagues. It's a virus that arrives wearing the friendly disguise of a bad cold: fever, fatigue, a little cough. And then your body breaks out in a crimson roadmap of misery. The rash starts at the hairline, descends the face, then takes over the torso like it's playing a game of how fast can we ruin everything. Measles doesn't just spot you, it wrecks your immune system. For weeks, even months afterward, your defenses are down. Pneumonia and encephalitis often tagged along, making what should have been a childhood inconvenience into a potential death sentence. In isolated or undernourished populations, mortality rates soared. Parents once whispered measles like it was a curse. And then, yes, diphtheria again. Because diphtheria didn't know how to take a hint. This bacterial disease especially loved children. It would set up shop in the throat and start producing a thick, grayish membrane that sealed off the airway like nature's cruelest gag gift. Kids choked slowly, unable to breathe, as the toxin damaged their heart and nerves in the background. Families were often told to sit quietly, hoping the child's gasps would stop one way or another. In the 19th century, diphtheria was called the strangling angel, poetic and horribly accurate. Next up, polio, the quiet terror of the 20th century. Before vaccines, it slipped through communities in summer, mostly unnoticed, until a child woke up one morning and couldn't move their legs, or their arms, or, in the most heartbreaking cases, their lungs. Some spent months in iron lungs, massive metal cylinders that breathed for them. Polio didn't always kill, but it changed lives overnight, replacing playgrounds with hospital wards and laughter with orthopedic braces. Franklin D. Roosevelt had it. So did thousands of less famous children who never walked the same way at all again. And finally, cradle cap. Sounds adorable, right? Like something knit by a Victorian aunt. But severe cradle cap, or infantile seborrheic dermatitis, can be grotesque. Imagine thick, greasy scales caking a baby's scalp, sometimes yellowing, sometimes cracking. It looks fungal, but it's not. It looks painful, but it usually isn't. Still, in historical contexts where hygiene was questionable and medical knowledge was worse, it frightened parents and midwives alike. Was it a sign of disease? A bad omen? Poor humors? No, just overactive oil glands. But that didn't stop people from scraping, salving, or even binding infants' heads in superstition and desperation. So as you drift off tonight, think about how far we've come, and how terrifyingly recent some of these nightmares are. Vaccines, soap, antibiotics, miracles, all, but history hasn't forgotten. And childhood, as sweet as it seems now, used to be anything but gentle. Hold on to that teddy bear. Breathe easy. You made it. Water is life, they say. But historically, it's also been death, especially if you were drinking it from a bucket that doubled as a footbath. For much of history, humans have excelled at building civilizations near rivers, lakes, and wells, then immediately defiling those sources with waste, corpses, or the occasional dead rat. The result? A long, grim parade of diseases that entered the body through a friendly-looking sip and exited in a much more dramatic fashion. Tonight, we explore the not-so-refreshing history of waterborne illness, where bad plumbing and worse decisions turned hydration into horror. Let's start with cholera back again, because it always comes back. It's the diva of diarrheal disease, sweeping through cities and camps like a gastrointestinal rock star. The culprit? Vibrio cholerae, a bacterium that thrives in contaminated water and poor sanitation. Once ingested, it goes to work rapidly. Within hours, you're losing fluids faster than you can name your regrets. The diarrhea is so profuse and watery that it's been described as rice water stools, a phrase no one ever wanted to hear. Dehydration sets in fast. Skin loses elasticity, eyes sink. Death arrives not from infection, but from your body becoming a dried-out raisin in record time. In the 19th century, cholera turned London and Paris into open-air cautionary tales. It killed millions, inspired revolts, and forced the invention of modern sewage systems. So, thank you, cholera? Giardiasis sounds like a villain in a fantasy novel, and in a way, it is. Caused by a microscopic parasite called Giardia lamblia, it's often found in untreated freshwater, the kind hikers brag about drinking without filters. Symptoms usually show up a week later, just as you've returned from the wilderness and resumed polite society. Then it begins. Cramps, bloating, nausea, and a foul-smelling diarrhea so iconic it's been described as greasy. Giardia doesn't kill quickly. It lingers. It humbles. And it serves as a reminder that clear water is not always clean water. Amoebic dysentery, meanwhile, skips the pretense and just wants to ruin your intestines. Caused by the amoeba Entamoeba histolytica, it spreads through fecal contamination, think unwashed hands, unsafe water, or poorly handled food. Once inside, it doesn't just cause diarrhea, it causes blood and mucus and ulceration of the intestinal walls. Left untreated, the amoebas can invade the liver, forming abscesses that feel like your organs are trying to hatch. Historically, it thrived in crowded, unclean environments, military camps, prisons, cities during siege. It's less about food poisoning and more about internal sabotage. Typhoid, brought to you by Salmonella typhi, is another frequent flyer in the hall of waterborne horrors. It spreads through contaminated water and food and presents with a slow burn fever, weakness, stomach pain, and sometimes a peculiar rash of rose-colored spots. But typhoid's true calling card is its ability to wreak havoc quietly. In the early 1900s, a woman named Mary Mallenbetter, known as Typhoid Mary, worked as a cook and unknowingly spread the disease to dozens. She was immune, but her food was not. Quarantined for years, she became a symbol of both public health and scapegoating. Typhoid doesn't always kill, but it can cause intestinal perforation, sepsis, and long hospital stays in countries that can't afford them. And finally, Shigella, famous but no less unpleasant. It's caused by Shigella bacteria, which require only a tiny amount to infect. The result? Diarrhea, often bloody, fever, stomach cramps, and the lingering sense that water was a mistake. Outbreaks frequently occur in places where hygiene is an afterthought: daycares, refugee camps, cruise ships if you're unlucky. Shigella is also becoming increasingly antibiotic resistant because, of course, it is, as if it wasn't rude enough already. So tonight, as you sip your filtered tap water or refill your reusable bottle from a safe kitchen sink, spare a thought for the centuries when water didn't come with trust. History is full of people who drank to live and ended up very quickly rethinking that plan. Sleep well, drink wisely, and never trust a puddle. Royalty is supposed to mean better food, better beds, and the kind of medical care that doesn't involve leeches unless they're gilded. But history, ever the sarcastic playwright, seems to love irony. And so we find that kings, queens, and emperors, despite their armies, jewels, and divine rights, were often walking cautionary tales of bad blood, worse genetics, and diseases that clung to crowns like cursed accessories. Tonight, we open the royal medicine chest. It's less gold and glory, more pain and powdered wigs. Let's begin with hemophilia, the literal bleeding curse of European royalty. It all starts with Queen Victoria, whose genes carried the hemophilia mutation quietly through the House of Hanover. When her children married into other royal families because royalty was one big game of genetic ping pong, the disease spread across Europe like an ill-timed toast. Her son Leopold died from a fall. Her descendants married into the Spanish, German, and Russian thrones. Most famously, her granddaughter Alexandra passed the gene to her son, the heir to the Russian Empire, Alexei Romanov. His hemophilia wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a political one. It helped usher in Rasputin, a mystic with eyebrow-raising influence over the Tsarina. And when the Romanovs fell, the boy's condition became a footnote in the story of a dynasty that bled literally to death. Then there's gout, the royal disease that sounds silly but feels like tiny knives stabbing your toes. Caused by an excess of uric acid in the blood, often brought on by overindulgence in meat, wine, and general aristocratic debauchery, gout was a badge of upper-class suffering. Henry VIII is the poster child. Between his banquet habits and his political executions, he limped into legend with swollen joints and a deeply unfortunate personality. Gout was called the disease of kings because poor people couldn't afford to eat themselves into it. Nobles bragged about their gout the way modern influencers show off blue check marks. Next up, the infamous madness of King George III. For decades, his mental breakdowns were ridiculed and dramatized. He rambled, he shouted, he wrote long letters to no one and talked to trees like they were old friends. While the cause is still debated, some suggest porphyria, others a psychiatric disorder. The results were catastrophic. Parliament took control. His son was installed as regent, and the British monarchy stumbled awkwardly into the 19th century with a reputation for instability that would linger well beyond powdered wigs. Scrofula, also known as the king's evil, was a form of tuberculosis that caused lymph nodes in the neck to swell grotesquely. The disease itself wasn't reserved for royalty, but the cure was. Monarchs across medieval Europe claimed the divine power to heal it with their touch. 6 citizens lined up for the privilege of being caressed by kings, who would lay hands, recite prayers, and hand out gold coins called touch pieces. It didn't really work, but the ritual kept the myth alive, that a king's body was sacred even if, under the robe, it was falling apart like everyone else's. And then there's inbreeding. European royalty, obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, often married cousins, nieces, or people who looked like slightly older versions of themselves. The results? A collection of facial anomalies, fertility issues, and genetic time bombs. The Habsburg Jawa protruding chin so extreme, it made chewing difficulties the most infamous example. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, was so physically and mentally unwell that historians now treat his reign like a slow-motion genetic collapse. He couldn't walk until he was 4, couldn't speak until he was 8, and died without heirs unless you count the era of war his death triggered. So tonight, as you lie comfortably beneath your decidedly non-royal sheets, consider the strange justice of history. Peasants may have suffered, but at least they didn't inherit kingdoms full of faulty genes and gold-plated diagnoses. Sometimes, the throne is just a very expensive seat at a very cursed table. There's something uniquely human about looking at something questionable on a plate and saying, probably fine. But food, especially when it comes with fins, hooves, or suspiciously undercooked edges, has a long history of biting back. For every glorious culinary invention, there's a darker menu filled with microscopic stowaways, neurotoxins, and slow-motion regrets. Tonight, we crack open that menu, one no one reads aloud, and look at what happens when eating turns into a slow-motion disaster. Let's start with trichinosis, a parasite you get from eating undercooked pork, wild game, or anything that once squealed and scurried through a forest. Caused by trichinella worms, it begins unassumingly, a stomachache, a bit of nausea, but then the larvae hatch and burrow into your muscles because your body is now their Airbnb. Symptoms ramp up: fast fever, facial swelling, joint pain, muscle weakness. In extreme cases, it can cause heart issues, brain inflammation, and death. In history, it lurked in every homemade sausage and suspicious stew. And when it hit, it didn't just ruin dinner, it ruined you. Anisakiasis is another gift from the animal kingdom, delivered via raw or undercooked fish. Sushi lovers, take note. This one's brought to you by anisakis, nematodes. These little worms invade the stomach lining like they're auditioning for a horror film. People report sudden, violent stomach pain, nausea, and the deeply disturbing sensation that something is alive inside them, which it is. In some cases, the worms crawl up into the throat. No, that's not a metaphor. The body eventually kills or expels the invader, but the trauma lingers. So does the mental image. Now, for a culinary curveball. Scombroid poisoning. Unlike the name suggests, this isn't caused by a rare tropical snake or the villain in a forgotten sci-fi movie. It's actually just fish mackerel, tuna, mahi-mahi that wasn't kept cold enough. When it spoils, it produces high levels of histamine. Eat it, and you might think you're having an allergic reaction. Flushing, rash, headache, vomiting, a racing heart. It kicks in fast, usually within minutes. You sweat, panic, itch. But it's not an allergy, it's just histamine overload from a fish that sat in the sun too long. A beach picnic gone wrong. Mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, is less about what the cow ate and more about what humans did to cows. In the 1980s and 90s, cattle were fed protein supplements made from ground-up animal parts, including nervous tissue from other cows. This led to the spread of misfolded proteins called prions, which slowly chewed through bovine brains like a glitch in the matrix. Humans who ate infected beef developed variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob diseasia, degenerative brain disorder with no cure and no mercy. The brain dissolves, memory vanishes, motor control collapses, death follows. And it all started with a burger that never should have existed. Finally, we have shellfish poisoning, the elegant, sea-scented terror of coastal cuisine. Shellfish, like mussels, clams, and oysters, can accumulate toxins from algae. These toxins don't cook out. If you eat the wrong bite, you might experience numbness, dizziness, vomiting, or full-body paralysis. It's called paralytic shellfish poisoning for a reason. Some cases end with a trip to the ER. Others end with respiratory failure. And the worst part? The shellfish always look the same fresh, briny, delicious, until your body starts shutting down, and the ocean exacts its revenge. So sleep well tonight, and maybe check the expiration date on that sushi, because food, while delicious, has always walked the razor-thin line between nourishment and nightmare. And history's stomach aches tend to stick around. Hospitals are supposed to be clean, sterile, safe, a place where wounds close, pain fades, and everything smells vaguely of antiseptic and bad coffee. But historically, and sometimes even now, surgery wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was the beginning. The scalpel might save your life, but it also opened a door. And on the other side of that door, bacteria, rot, and the occasional surprise maggot. Tonight, we descend into the deeply unpleasant realm of post-surgical horrors, where survival was never guaranteed and the real drama began after the stitches. Let's begin with sepsis, which isn't a disease so much as your body's dramatic overreaction to an infection. Post-surgery, a tiny bit of bacteria sneaks in, maybe through the wound, maybe from the tools, maybe from someone breathing too hard near the incision. Your immune system notices and goes full Shakespearean tragedy. It floods your body with chemicals, leading to inflammation everywhere. Blood pressure crashes, organs shut down, limbs go cold. You can have the best surgery in the world, but if sepsis shows up, it can all unravel in a matter of hours. In the pre-antibiotic era, even a simple cut could spiral into a full-body meltdown. Surgeons would stand helpless as patients went from fine to gone before the sutures had time to settle. Then, there's MRSA methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, a bacterial infection that basically looks at antibiotics and says, no thanks. It lurks in hospitals, on surfaces, in wounds. It spreads easily, resists treatment aggressively, and turns post-operative care into a high-stakes game of medical chess. A tiny bit of MRSA in a surgical wound can mean abscesses, fevers, and weeks of IV antibiotics that may or may not work. Worst-case scenario? The infection spreads to the bloodstream, bones, or heart. Modern hospitals now swab noses, isolate patients, and scrub like raccoons on caffeine just to keep MRSA at bay. It's the boss level of surgical infections, and it doesn't play fair. Gas gangrene sounds like something invented to frighten Victorian schoolchildren, and it absolutely delivers. Caused by Clostridium perfringens, it thrives in oxygen-deprived wounds like the kind left after surgery, especially in wartime. Once inside, the bacteria release toxins that destroy tissue and produce gas, swelling the skin like a balloon and making it crackle to the touch. Yes, crackle. It's one of the few diseases you can feel. Pop. Left untreated, it moves quickly, devouring muscles and organs in hours. Amputation is often the only answer. And even then, it might not be enough. Tetanus, also known as lockjaw, is less about the wound and more about what might have been lurking on the rusty tool that made it. It's caused by Clostridium tetani, a bacterium that produces a neurotoxin so potent it can cause full-body muscle spasms. After surgery or even a simple puncture of tetanus gets in, the jaw clenches shut, then the spine arches. Then the body stiffens like a human board. Breathing becomes difficult. Death can arrive not from the infection itself, but from suffocation. Before vaccines, it was a terrifyingly common post-surgical fate. Even now, it still happens in places where sterility and boosters are in short supply. And finally, surgical worm infections. Yes, you read that right. In certain tropical environments, parasites have been known to exploit surgical wounds, laying eggs in the moist, warm spaces left behind. Within days, larvae hatch and begin their tiny journey through flesh. The skin swells, itches, sometimes wriggles. Patients report feeling movement beneath their stitches because there is movement. Removal involves forceps, horror, and a deep existential crisis. It's rare, it's awful, and it makes surgical tape feel like flimsy protection from a very squirmy fate. So tonight, As you lie safely in your clean, climate-controlled bed, appreciate the miracle of antiseptics, antibiotics, and sterile gloves. Post-surgery nightmares still exist, but we've gotten much better at waking up from them. Most of the time. Wars are supposed to be won with strategy, courage, and very loud speeches, but often they're decided by something far less glamorous: microbes. Bacteria and viruses don't care about borders, honor, or which general has the shinier hat. They slip into trenches, ride on fleas, and turn well-fed soldiers into feeble wrecks. In fact, some of history's most pivotal military moments came not from battlefield heroics, but from someone sneezing in the wrong direction or sharing a contaminated spoon. Tonight, we unpack the biological side of warfare where disease doesn't just follow armies, it leads them. Trench fever was World War I's less dramatic but incredibly persistent villain. Caused by Bartonella quintana, spread by lice, and fueled by mud-soaked misery, it infected millions of soldiers crammed into narrow, rat-infested trenches. It didn't usually kill, but it did knock men out of action for weeks. Symptoms included high fever, dizziness, leg pain, and the creeping suspicion that your uniform was actively trying to murder you. The lice burrowed into seams, laid eggs in socks, and survived soap with unnerving skill. Whole battalions itched, scratched, and limped their way through the war, not from bullets, but from bacteria hitching rides on underwashed underwear. Then came the Spanish flu, arguably the greatest biological ambush in human history. It hit in 1918, just as World War I was ending, and it spread faster than any army ever could. Soldiers brought it home, civilians spread it further, and the planet coughed as one. What made it worse? It didn't just kill the old or frail, it went after healthy young adults with brutal efficiency. Entire regiments were wiped out without firing a shot. Hospitals overflowed. Morgues ran out of space. Some military historians argue the flu affected peace treaties more than diplomacy ever did, simply because so many leaders and troops were too sick or dead to argue. Let's rewind a bit to Napoleon's army, not during a great battle, but during their mass gastrointestinal betrayal at the hands of dysentery. As his grand army marched across Europe, food supplies grew scarce and water supplies grew suspicious. Soldiers drank from ditches, streams, and puddles, with more frogs than filtration. Dysentery set in violent diarrhea, cramps, dehydration, and a complete inability to march, let alone fight. More of Napoleon's soldiers were taken down by this bacterial misery than by enemy fire. And no matter how great your tactics are, they don't mean much if your entire army is doubled over behind bushes. Fast forward to the Pacific Theater in World War II, where scabies became a quiet but relentless saboteur. Caused by tiny mites burrowing into the skin, it spread like gossip in the jungle. Soldiers developed itchy rashes, blistering sores, and a persistent urge to crawl out of their own uniforms. In the humid tropics, with limited access to hygiene and a lot of sweaty close contact, it became a logistical nightmare. Morale dropped. Supplies of permethrin skyrocketed, and entire units scratched their way through missions with the coordination of an angry chorus line. Lastly, typhus in World War I, carried by lice again, because lice never take a vacation. Typhus was a viral grenade. Symptoms began like the flu but escalated quickly into hallucinations, rashes, and organ failure. In the Eastern Front especially, typhus swept through trenches, towns, and entire regiments. Hospitals overflowed, quarantine failed, and commanders realized, too late, that disease doesn't negotiate. By the time a ceasefire could be signed, many soldiers had already died in their own sweat-soaked bunks. So tonight, remember this: war may be fought with guns and glory, but it's often decided in field hospitals, latrines, and lice-infested socks. Hygiene saves lives. Disease rewrites empire sand sometimes. The greatest threat isn't the enemy you can see. It's the one hitching a ride on your canteen. There's a certain category of disease that sits quietly in history's waiting room. The symptoms were real, the suffering undeniable. But the cause? Shrug. Sometimes we blame the air. sometimes demons, sometimes microwave weapons, which honestly says more about us than the illness itself. These are the medical, mysterious, terrifying, theatrical, and frustratingly unexplained. They arrive, ruin everything, and vanish like ghosts that forgot to clean up. Tonight, we peek into that foggy corner of history where the body breaks down and science just watches, baffled. Take, for instance, the infamous sweating sickness of 15th and 16th century England. It came out of nowhere, killed within hours, and then disappeared entirely, leaving behind no clear pathogen, no vaccine, and no closure. Victims would be perfectly fine one moment, then suddenly struck by chills, delirium, intense sweating, and death before sunset. Royalty and peasants alike dropped like overcooked flies. Entire towns were paralyzed with fear. Even Henry VIII reportedly fled multiple cities just to avoid it. No one knew where it came from or how to stop it. Today, it remains one of the creepiest unsolved plagues in history, like a jump scare with medical credentials. Then there's Phossy Jaw, a ghastly industrial illness that mostly afflicted 19th century matchstick factory workers, especially young women. Caused by long-term exposure to white phosphorus, this was the era's most horrifying workplace hazard. At first, it just looked like a toothache. But then, slowly and gruesomely, the jawbone would begin to rot. Literally rot. It glowed faintly in the dark. It emitted a foul smell. Bone fragments would fall out. Some workers lived for years with gaping holes where their faces used to be. And the worst part? Employers knew. But matches were cheap, and so were lives back then. Havana syndrome is newer, but no less strange. First reported by U.S. and Canadian diplomats in Cuba in 2016. The symptoms read like the setup to a Cold War thriller. Piercing sounds, pressure in the head, dizziness, nausea, memory loss. Victims described it as being hit by a beam. Theories flew microwave weapons, psychological warfare, mass hysteria, rogue crickets. Yes, seriously. But years later, we still don't know what it is. Some people recover, others don't. The mystery lingers like a bad frequency that nobody can turn off. Now, let's drift back in time to the vapors, a grab bag diagnosis mostly assigned to women from the 17th to 19th centuries. Feeling faint, emotional, breathless, you had the vapors. It was blamed on everything from bad air to wandering wombs. Treatments included smelling salts, bloodletting, marriage, and occasionally bed rest in a room filled with lavender. In reality, it likely covered a mix of anxiety, depression, hormonal imbalances, and social repression. But rather than address any of that, history just wrapped it up in lace and declared it mysterious. A non-diagnosis with maximum drama. And then there's Kuru, the neurological disease that haunted the four people of Papua New Guinea. Its cause? Ritual cannibalism, specifically, eating the brains of deceased relatives as an act of mourning and honor. Unfortunately, those brains sometimes contain prions, the same deadly proteins behind mad cow disease. Kuru began with tremors and trouble walking, progressed to fits of laughter, and ended in death. It disproportionately affected women and children, who were more likely to partake in the ritual. Once the practice stopped, so did the disease. But the mystery of its emergence and its eerie symptoms still chills the bones. So tonight, if your body ever feels slightly off, remember, it could be anything. Maybe something benign, maybe something historical, maybe something that hasn't been explained, named, or believed yet. After all, the human body is complicated and occasionally horrifying. Sweet dreams. Try not to sweat too much. It's comforting to think that the age of great plagues is behind us, sealed off in dusty textbooks and dramatic museum exhibits with skeletons in corsets. But plagues don't care about time. They don't need cobblestones, leeches, or medieval music to wreak havoc. They adapt. They evolve. And just when humanity thinks it's figured out soap and science, something microscopic clears its throat in a bat cave, a lab fridge, or a commuter train and says, "Surprise! Modern plagues aren't elegant. They're not polite. But they still carry the unmistakable, eerie echo of something ancient and they're not done with us yet. Let's begin with the one that redefined this century's idea of normal, COVID-19. A virus that started in a city most people couldn't locate on a map and ended up in every single kitchen, bedroom, and overly wiped-down doorknob on Earth. Symptoms ranged from "this feels like allergies" to "I can't breathe and everything tastes like cardboard." Entire countries shut down. Grandparents learned to Zoom. Toilet paper became emotional currency. And what started as a medical event became a psychological one. Loneliness, grief, paranoia, denial, reinvention. The virus didn't just attack lungs, it rewired society. And like the great plagues of old, it left a scar that's still twitching. Then came monkeypox, a disease with a name that sounds like a cartoon but feels very much like a viral flashback. Blisters, fever, lymph node swelling, basically a mix between chickenpox and "why is my skin doing that?" Once a rare zoonotic virus from Central and West Africa, it jumped borders fast, helped along by modern travel and some very bad luck. What makes it especially unsettling is how familiar it feels. Skin lesions, quarantine, public confusion. We've read this chapter before. And now, we're living in the sequel. Hantavirus is the horror movie you never bought a ticket for. Spread by rodent droppings, yes, dropping sit lurks in barns, basements, and anywhere a deer mouse has taken the world's tiniest bathroom break. Inhalation of contaminated particles can trigger a violent illness that escalates quickly. Fever, muscle aches, shortness of breath, and in severe cases, respiratory failure. It's rare, but when it strikes, it does so with a brutal suddenness that feels lifted straight from an 1800s fever dream. Only now, the horses have been replaced by pickup trucks, and the barns have Wi-Fi. Then there's antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis, proof that bacteria are patient and vengeful. TB used to be the Victorian boogeyman, coughing up blood in candlelit rooms. But we cured it with antibiotics, until we overused them. Now, multi-drug-resistant strains are spreading again, especially in densely populated regions. It takes longer to treat, costs more, and kills faster. TB is back wearing a modern outfit but carrying the same old scythe. And finally, there's the next big one. We don't know what it is yet, but scientists agree it's probably lurking. It might leap from an animal, escape from melting permafrost, or evolve in a forgotten rainforest. It could spread fast or slow. It might be a virus, a fungus, a bacteria with an attitude problem. What's certain is that we'll be unprepared in all the same ways we always are: denial, confusion, panic buying beans. And just like in the old days, the first symptom will likely be something boring. A sniffle, a cough, a headline. So as you drift off tonight, comfort yourself with this. Humanity has survived thousands of years of invisible terrors. We adapt, we mask up, we argue about vaccines. And through it all, we remain defiantly alive. Sleep tight, wash your hands, and try not to lick anything mysterious.